What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you!
There are games you miss because you never had access to them. Wrong console, wrong time, wrong circumstances. And then there are games you miss on purpose. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was one of those. I didn't grow up with it. I didn't rent it. I didn't borrow it from a mate. I walked straight past it. And at the time, I thought I was making a reasonable decision because this was the late 90s. Everything was turning 3D. Polygons were the future. Death was the point. And there was Castlevania, flat, pixelated, side on, looking like it had arrived from the late Super Nintendo era with the wrong clothes on. It didn't see timeless, it saw backwards, which is funny now, painful actually, but completely understandable. Because when you're a kid, progress looks like technology, not design, and Castlevania looked like it had missed the memo. I also wasn't a Castlevania kid. The earlier games had already taught me a lesson I didn't enjoy learning. They were hard, unforgiving, deliberate in a way that felt hostile if you didn't grow up with them. I remember trying them, I remember failing quickly, and I remember deciding very efficiently they weren't for me. So Symphony of the Night passed me by, not because it wasn't available, not because it wasn't praised, because I thought I already knew what it was, which might be the most dangerous assumption you can make about a game. Years later, much later, after the hype had solidified into something almost suspicious, I finally played it, not as a kid chasing novelty, not as someone trying to keep up, but as an adult, with patience, context, and a much better understanding of why certain games survive generations. And that's when it happened, that quiet, uncomfortable realisation. Oh, I was wrong. And I think I know exactly when the realisation started. The thing that surprised me most when I finally played Symphony of the Night properly wasn't the castle. It was the movement. Within seconds, genuinely seconds, I trusted it. Alucard moves with confidence, not speed, not flash, confidence. He doesn't skid, he doesn't overcorrect, he doesn't feel like he's fighting the controller. He moves like the game knows exactly how fast you're meant to think. And that's rare, because a lot of older games, especially the difficult ones, mistake stiffness for challenge. Symphony of the Night doesn't. It feels deliberate without feeling punishing. You walk a few steps, you jump, you land exactly where you're expected, and your brain immediately relaxes, which is a dangerous thing to do in a Castlevania game. The animations help you more than you realise at first. Nothing is wasted, every swing has weight, every step has purpose, even standing still feels intentional. This isn't a character waiting for an input, this is a character ready. And then there's the music, not a fanfare, not a declaration, just atmosphere. It doesn't tell you how to feel, it doesn't rush you, it simply exists in the space, confident enough to let silence do some of the work, which is when it clicked for me. The game isn't trying to impress you in the first 5 minutes, it's trying to convince you it can be trusted, and that's a very adult design decision. Enemies appear quickly, but they don't overwhelm, they test you, they exist to teach spacing, timing and patience, not reflexes. If you get hit, it's usually clear why. If you succeed, it feels earned without being congratulatory. No fanfare, no praise, just quiet competence. And that's when I realised why I'd bounced off the earlier Castlevania games as a kid. It wasn't the difficulty, it was the rigidity. Earlier entries demanded precision before earning trust. Symphony of the Night does the opposite. It gives you control first, then asks what you're going to do with it, which makes exploration feel inviting rather than hostile. The castle doesn't feel like a gauntlet, it feels like a space with rules, sure, but rules you're encouraged to learn, not punished for misunderstanding. You start noticing little things, the way rooms connect, the way verticality matters, the way enemies are placed not just to attack you, but to shape movement. And suddenly, The 2D presentation I once dismissed feels like a strength. Nothing is hidden behind camera tricks. Nothing is obscured by perspective. You see the space clearly, and you're trusted to navigate it. That trust changes everything, because once a game trusts you, you start trusting it back. You experiment, you push forward, you get curious. And curiosity is the engine that drives Symphony of the Night. Not difficulty, not punishment, curiosity. Which is exactly why, within minutes, I wasn't thinking about what the game wasn't doing. I wasn't missing polygons. I wasn't wishing for 3D. I was already thinking, what's through the door? What's below me? What happens if I go the other way? That's the moment you're hooked. Not because the game demanded attention, but because it earned it quietly. It wasn't a magazine review. It wasn't a forum post. It was late nights on game trailers, watching someone else absolutely lose their mind over Castlevania, angry video game nerds episodes, clips breaking down mechanics, secrets, difficulty, not mocking the game, but exposing just how much depth I ignored. I wasn't laughing at the game, I was laughing at myself, because suddenly all these things I thought were flaws, the difficulty, the precision, the refusal to hold your hand, were being framed as intent. That's when it hit me. I hadn't avoided Castlevania because it was bad. I avoided it because it demanded more than I was ready to give. The moment Symphony of the Night fully reveals what it's doing isn't a boss fight. It's the map. Or more specifically, the moment you realise the castle isn't a sequence of challenges, it's a place. Most games from this era present levels like tasks. You enter, you overcome, you leave. Castlevania Symphony of the Night doesn't work like that. You don't clear rooms, you learn them. The castle unfolds slowly, deliberately, like it's gauging how observant you are before deciding how much to show you. Rooms connect vertically, horizontally, sometimes illogically, and instead of feeling confusion, it feels honest, because real spaces aren't neat. They loop back on themselves, they add shortcuts, they reveal secrets long after you thought you were done with them. The first time you hit a dead end in Symphony of the Night, the game doesn't panic. It doesn't flash an objective. It doesn't point you in the correct direction. It simply lets you stand there, map open, realising, oh, I'm stuck. I'm just not ready. That's a powerful shift, because suddenly progress isn't about execution. It's about understanding. You're not being tested on reflexes. You're being tested on memory. You start recognising rooms you've been in before, not because the game reminds you, but because you remember them. The place with the stairs, the room with the weird enemy, that ledge I couldn't quite reach. And that's when the map stops being a utility and starts being a conversation. It's not telling you where to go, it's asking, what do you remember? The brilliance here is how patient the design is. The game doesn't rush you towards mastery. It lets confusion exist without punishing it. You wander, you experiment, you double back, and instead of feeling lost, you feel curious, which is a very fine line to walk, because most games confuse curiosity with aimlessness. Symphony of the Night understands the difference. Every new ability doesn't unlock progress, it recontextualizes the entire castle. Suddenly, that unreachable ledge isn't a tease, it's an invitation, and the humour creeps in here quietly, because you start realising the castle has been smoked this whole time. Oh, you couldn't quite reach that earlier? That's fine, we'll wait. It's not hostile, it's patient, which somehow feels more intimidating. The design trusts you to keep a mental checklist of unfinished business. No quest log, no blinking markers, just you, the map, and a growing sense that you're slowly getting smarter. That's the difference between a level and a world. Levels challenge you in the moment, worlds challenge you over time, and Symphony of the Night is absolutely a world, which is why the idea that it was just a 2D game feels so absurd in hindsight. This isn't a throwback. It's a refinement of something 3D games were still struggling to figure out, how to make space feel meaningful without turning it into noise. The castle isn't big for the sake of it, it's layered, and once you understand that, the entire game clicks into place. You're not progressing forward, you're progressing deeper, and that's when the game stops feeling old and starts feeling timeless. Combat in Symphony of the Night doesn't announce itself as revolutionary, it doesn't need to. It just feels right. From the first few encounters, it's obvious this isn't about survival in an old Castlevania sense. You're not inching forward, terrified of every mistake. You're not memorising enemy placements like a punishment routine. You're engaging. Swinging feels responsive. Spacing matters. Timing matters. But failure never feels spiteful. And that's the key difference. Earlier Castlevania games felt like they were daring you to continue. Symphony of the Night invites you to improve. You hit an enemy and see a damage number pop up quietly, matter-of-factly. No drama, no spectacle, just information. And that tiny decision changes everything. Because now you're not guessing, you're learning. You understand why something took longer to kill. You understand when you're underpowered. And instead of thinking, this is unfair, you think, okay, I'll come back later. That shift from frustration to planning is the soul of this game. The RPG elements don't overpower the action, they support it. Leveling up feels natural, not mandatory. You don't grind because the game forces you to. You grind because curiosity nudges you into spaces where experience happens organically. Enemies give you just enough resistance to keep things interesting. Bosses feel imposing, but not invincible. When you lose, it's rarely a mystery. You know what went wrong, and knowing why you failed makes trying again feel reasonable rather than exhausting. Weapons are another quiet triumph. There are a lot of them, more than you'd expect, and none of them feel like jokes. Every new blade changes rhythm. Some are faster, some hit harder, some feel elegant, some feel brutal. You're not just upgrading stats, you're choosing a personality, which is a very clever way of making progression feel personal. The game never locks you into the correct build. It lets you experiment without pushing curiosity, and when you find a weapon that clicks, you feel it immediately, not because the numbers spike, because movement and combat suddenly sync up. There's also a generosity here that younger me would have completely misunderstood. Healing items exist, save points are frequent, the game wants you to keep playing. That doesn't make it easy, it makes it respectful. Symphony of the Night assumes your time matters, which is something a lot of modern games still struggle with. The difficulty curve is smooth but not flat. You feel stronger as you go, not because enemies get weaker, but because you get more confident. Your reactions sharpen, your understanding deepens, and the humour, if there's any, comes from contrast. This is a game about vampires, werewolves, monsters, and operatic drama, and yet it's remarkably restrained. No overlong tutorials, no condescension, just systems that trust you to notice patterns and make decisions. Which is why, at some point, you stop thinking about combat at all. It becomes part of the flow. You're moving, fighting, exploring, all as one continuous action. And that's when you realise how carefully this was tuned. Nothing here is accidental, nothing is cruel, everything feels considered. And for a game I once dismissed as too old-fashioned, that level of care feels quietly humbling. There's a moment in Symphony of the Night where you stop thinking about the mechanics entirely, not because they disappear, but because they dissolve into the background, and what's left is atmosphere. This is a game that understands something very rare. You don't need to constantly remind the player that they're playing something important. The music doesn't demand attention, it earns it. Tracks drift in and out without ever pushing themselves forward. They don't tell you when to feel heroic. They don't underline danger in a red marker. They just exist confidently, like you know you'll notice eventually, and you do. You'll be moving through the castle, half focused on exploration, and suddenly realise you've stopped for no reason other than the fact that the music feels right. Not catchy in a modern sense, not bombastic, memorable because it understands restraint. Each area has its own identity, but none of them shout. There's no sense that the soundtrack is competing with the gameplay. It's supporting it quietly, patiently, which is why it holds up well decades later. So many games from this era lean heavily into the soundtracks to carry them. Symphony of the Night doesn't need that. The atmosphere comes from cohesion, the colour palette, the animation style, the way enemies move, the way the castle just breathes. Not an ear feels dated because not an ear was chasing trends. The game wasn't trying to sound modern, it was trying to sound appropriate, and that difference matters. The gothic tone never tips into parody, it knows how close it is to excess, and deliberately steps back. You don't get melodrama layered on melodrama, You get confidence, which is why revisiting it now doesn't feel like nostalgia tourism. It feels like discovering something that was always operating on a different wavelength. There's also something worth saying about how quiet the game is when it wants to be. Moments of silence aren't accidents. They're pauses, breathing room. The game trusts you to sit in a space without filling it with noise or instruction. That trust is everywhere. In pacing, in the music, in the lack of urgency. Symphony of the Night never rushes you because it doesn't fear being forgotten. It knows you're not leaving, and when a game knows that, it can afford to be subtle. That subtlety is why this doesn't age. Not because it looks retro cool, but because it never leans on novelty in the first place. You're not impressed by technology, you're absorbed by mood, and mood, when done properly, doesn't expire, it just waits for you to catch up, which is exactly what happened here. I didn't appreciate this game as a kid because I was looking for a spectacle. Now I appreciate it because it refuses to beg for attention. It assumes you're capable of meeting it halfway, and that assumption, that quiet confidence, is why Symphony of the Night doesn't look like a relic. It feels like a standard. There's a strange kind of regret that comes with games like this. Not the dramatic kind. Not the I miss my childhood kind. Something quieter. Symphony of the Night didn't fail me when I was younger. I failed it. And I don't mean that as a self-flagellation or revisionist guilt. I mean it literally. I wasn't ready for what it was offering. As a kid, I wanted momentum. I wanted spectacle. I wanted to see the future arriving in real time, one polygon at a time. I didn't want patience. I didn't want restraint. I didn't want to think about space and pacing. I wanted to move forward, and Symphony of the Night doesn't care about forward, it cares about understanding. That's the part I couldn't have appreciated back then, because this is a game that assumes you'll slow down eventually, that one day you'll value cohesion over novelty, design over technology, confidence over noise. It's not smug about it, it just waits. And when you finally arrive years later with better taste and less urgency, it opens up completely. That's what makes it sting a little. Not because I missed it, but because it was always there, doing exactly what it was meant to do, regardless of whether I was paying attention. There's also something reassuring in that. This game didn't need to validate it. It didn't need nostalgia to survive. It didn't need reinvention every year to stay relevant. It simply stayed good, which is an uncomfortable thing to realise when you think back at how confidently you dismissed it. But it's also kind of comforting, because it means good design outlasts trends. It just waits for you to grow into it. And coming back to it now, after FIFA marathons, horror exhaustion, and sheer index administration, it feels like a reminder of why this challenge exists in the first place. Not just to survive the library, but to understand it, to find the moments where my past assumptions were wrong, where my taste was incomplete, where a game wasn't outdated, I was just impatient. Symphony of the Night isn't perfect because it's old. It's perfect because it knew exactly what it wanted to be when everything else was still trying to look impressive. And that kind of confidence doesn't age. With this entry complete, index number 31 is done. 31 games played out of 1,278. And if the FIFA episode proved this challenge is achievable, Symphony of the Night proved why it's worth doing. Because buried in this library, between yearly sport releases, licensed filler, and technical experiments, are games that don't just survive their era, they understand it. This wasn't about nostalgia, it wasn't about finally getting a classic. It was about realising that sometimes the game doesn't miss you, you miss the game, and it just waits. The PSX index continues. Next up, we trade capes and castles for suppressed pistols and night vision goggles. Index entries from 32 up to 34, the Siphon Filter trilogy, a series that absolutely did feel modern at the time, serious, tactical, very convinced it was saying something important. No patience this time, no restraint, just crouching, rolling and setting people on fire with a taser, which somehow was considered acceptable stealth design. Castlevania asked me to slow down. Siphon Filter is about to ask me to stay low, watch corners and trust the lock-on. Different energy, same index. I'll see you in the shadows.